Alright, what's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. I'm Tokenicer, and I'm here to bring you guys in-depth news, analysis, and insights from the digital asset space, along with covering the progressive tokenization of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to check out Tokenicer.network for all my content platforms in one spot. From my Twitter threads, Medium articles, Spotify podcasts, YouTube videos, interviews, and much more. And as always, that'll be right down in the description below. So in today's video, we're going to be going further into the energy web ecosystem from our initial introduction about a month ago and giving it an official deep dive. And as usual, I'll be leaving the introduction episode right up here for you guys to check out and get familiar with the energy web ecosystem before coming back, as we'll be getting into some pretty advanced topics in terms of their operations and connections. Energy web has basically snuck up in the background to becoming one of my absolute favorite projects in this space. From just how original of an initiative they're going towards, to sort of the moat they've built around themselves for that respective sector in the strength of their connections. And just before we start, I gotta remind you guys real quick that I'm not a financial advisor, and therefore nothing you ever hear or read from me should ever be taken as any form of financial or investment advice. But now that we got that out of the way, let's get right into it. So within the energy web introduction, we covered some of the general operations in the ecosystem, such as what their goal is, how they plan to achieve that, the connections within their team, different operations and case studies they've carried out, and of course the energy web token. But let's look a little further under the microscope and see what we can dig up. So yes, we already have a working energy grid, right? But much like how we already have a financial system, it's being disrupted in front of our very eyes. With all the innovative distributed energy resources coming into our economy more and more, like solar panels, wind turbines, hydropower, etc., there's one big problem. These energy resources work in complete silo, not just from each other, but also the energy grid itself, which is a massive hassle. When the energy grid's not connected, it becomes all that much harder to balance. And by balance, we're simply talking about balancing the amount of energy demanded with the amount of energy being generated. Basic supply and demand, right? And so the way they plan to connect this energy grid is through their network, the EWT, short for Energy Web Decentralized Operating System. This is the system that'll help them fulfill their vision of reconnecting, balancing, and transitioning us to a global energy grid of distributed energy resources. One point of focus they've really had is around the concepts of having decentralized identities live on the energy web chain within their trust layer. As we mentioned in the introduction, there's three main layers to the energy web decentralized operating system, right? Being the trust, utility, and applications or toolkits layer. Let's look into each one of these layers briefly. So as we mentioned, the energy web chain is the foundational layer to really let the magic happen within the energy web ecosystem. With some of the main functions of the energy web chain being focused around providing a place to store and recall or use the digital identities of every part of the energy web ecosystem and their credentials through smart contracts, facilitate, validate, and execute on-chain applications and utilities built onto the energy web chain. Next up is the utility layer within the EWT. This is basically what it sounds like. It provides utilities to the energy web chain with all the digital identities and credentials it stores. For the most part, these are back-end applications that are mostly cloud-based services that are required by all applications in their ecosystem, being real-time data provided by utility nodes secured through staking energy web token. And as we can see here are just some examples of those utilities being common things we hear in this space, like name services, libraries, oracles, bridging, etc. Then finally, let's look into the toolkits and application layer, where it really is like the icing on top, letting everything flow together. And looking a little further, there's a few main applications in this layer that really create for a more complete system around the EWT operations. First, there's Switchboard, which is an identity access and management system. This is the tool given to application builders to set parameters and permissions around identities and verifiable claims. This of course ties perfectly with everything they're doing with digital self-sovereign identities, in allowing these applications to customize and build specific presets to which each identity under each specific application would find fitting. So an example of this being used could be like, say, an EV charging application is launched on Energy Web. Well, some of the use cases with Switchboard could be like, what info needs to be verified for the EV to charge? Or what's the primary ID attached to this specific EV's identity? Then there's also Energy Web Origin and Zero. Zero is basically a solution for renewable energy buyers to find renewable energy producers around the world. So this is basically a global search engine for RECs, or renewable energy certificates, or other decarbonization products tokenized onto the Energy Web chain. Then Origin is kind of like the opposite of Zero, which really complements each other, and its main use case being data provenance to be able to trace the ownership of the renewable energy, along with being a public open source solution for energy providers of any kind to connect to and operate on the new energy operating system from distributed energy resources. Now, the last part of the tool parts section we'll touch up on is Flex. As you guys can see, it's not on the current EWT layout that we've been looking at, but it was previously included in some of their previous models. Basically, with Flex, it allows for further flexibility with the new grid, in addition to also being a toolkit for distributed energy resource integration into the Energy Web. So some examples of what can be done are like, say, for example, registering batteries, solar panels, or other distributed energy resources onto the Flex toolkit, which in return, you can be incentivized to help balance the grid with your registered resources now. And they can also set parameters around how their assets are used. For example, let's say someone registers an EV, sets some parameters that an individual might want to set, which could be like, allow this EV to help balance and make me as much money as possible tonight, but I still need to have 50 kilometers of mileage or range by 8 a.m. to go about my day. And of course, you can scale that out to a larger scale sense, like think an enterprise that works directly with solar panels. Flex can also allow users who request flexibility, like grid operators, that may want to set specific parameters on certain points and assets on the parts of the grid that they manage. Then it enters the Flex system, either as a message requesting positive or negative flexibility, with positive flexibility meaning bringing more power to the grid, and negative flexibility meaning to withdraw power from the grid. Then the system will automatically select the offers at the best prices that meet this request without violating other constraints. And finally, the grid operator can choose to accept or reject these specific offers depending on if it fits their needs in that price point. So it fits the name, right? Energy Web Flex helps with the grid flexibility. One example I always think of when looking into the Energy Web decentralized operating system is like a pizza. At the foundational layer, where the Energy Web lies is the crust, where the foundation of everything built upon lays. Without the crust, it all falls apart, right? Then the utility layer is like the cheese. Every pizza needs some cheese, just like how any regulated enterprise-grade blockchain network needs to have supported use cases in their ecosystem to expand and connect. And then finally, the toppings layer is like the applications and toolkits layer, with every pizza being slightly different, but at the end of the day, a layer that's meant for customization and building it to your own liking. And of course, consensus and validation of the correct data will be vital to their operations, which is why they're using proof of authority within a permission system. As we covered in the intro, the network is completely public and permissionless, so any device or person can join. But to validate and do other authoritative operations on Energy Web, such as validate data, it's a permission system. And here we can see the group of validators in their permission setting, and as we can see, it's a bunch of players within the industry and members of the Energy Web Foundation. But now that we have a better understanding of the EWT's primary operations, let's turn back the clock a little and look into the beginnings of how Energy Web came about, because least to say, it's been quite a journey. So as we discussed in the introduction, we know that the Energy Web Foundation is technically founded by two other organizations, that being the Rocky Mountain Institute and Grid Singularity. Both organizations that also have a common focus on clean energy adoption, just like Energy Web. It makes sense, right? We also explained a little bit of Rocky Mountain Institute during our introduction, and put simply, they're like Energy Web before Energy Web, minus the blockchain parts. They're a non-profit association based in Colorado that's focused on decarbonization of energy systems, and they've been in the game for about 40 years. So there's definitely some history and reputation from them, as you probably got to be a pretty notable and relevant organization to stick around for that long, right? They started out just as a team of two, with Amori and Hunter Lovins, who were actually happily married together at the time. Amori is an American author and physicist, while Hunter is an environmental activist who's worked on various projects while also winning multiple awards for her studies and work in that area. Things were looking like they were progressing pretty well within the organization. Some examples are like the term negawatt, which was actually created by Amori Lovins himself as a word to describe a unit in watts of electrical power saved back in 1989, and eventually actually got added into the Oxford English Dictionary in 2003. Amori had also developed a concept of what he called a hypercar. Of course, this term has a completely different meaning today, in which it usually signifies the most superior high-performance cars like McLaren P1, Bugatti Chiron, Porsche 918 Spider, and a small list of others on that tier. But back in the day, what Amori deemed a hypercar was one that would be very light, hybrid electric, and overall just efficient in all aspects. And this has obviously laid the groundwork for countless innovations in the automotive sector that we're seeing still unfold to this day, right? They had also published some books that even remain relevant today, with the two most notable ones being Brittle Power and Natural Capitalism, which were published in 1982 and 1999 respectively. So they initially both ran as co-CEOs together, along with founding the organization. But then in 2002, Hunter decided to step down from her role as co-CEO to focus on other projects, in addition to the fact that she didn't see eye to eye with the board of directors on philosophies about expanding the think tank. So for a while, Amori ended up being the sole CEO. But since then, they've only continued to expand further with their operations and partners, ranging from setting up in China back in 2013, helping with developing India's energy infrastructure, and of course co-founding a spin-off of their initiative using blockchain technology with various other large industry players. Next up, let's look into the foundations of Grid Singularity. They can basically be described as an open source peer-to-peer energy exchange marketplace based in Germany. And as it's a public grid, anyone can go on their website and take a look around. And I suggest you guys check it out because it's a pretty cool interactive map of different energy providers, demanders, etc. Now, additionally, they organize the event Horizon, which is an annual summit for energy and blockchains. Both of these guys, much like Energy Web, work pretty closely with the World Economic Forum on various initiatives and agendas about sustainability. So you got Rocky Mountain Institute, which much like Energy Web, a non-profit organization with a focus on clean decarbonization of the world. And then you got Grid Singularity, an open source energy network for different entities to basically mix and match a supplier with a demander together to help balance the grid. It's almost like Rocky Mountain Institute and Grid Singularity really let the sparks fly and had a baby, naming it Energy Web. Yes, the pun was intended. Congrats if you got it. This is because, well, Energy Web really is like a little mix of both of these. A non-profit organization made of various members to decarbonize the world, just like Rocky Mountain Institute. Yup, we got that. A global energy grid built with blockchain to match suppliers with demanders, just like Grid Singularity. We also got that. So, most people know by now, Rocky Mountain Institute and Grid Singularity were of course the main founders of Energy Web. But what most people don't know is that there's another group of large companies that were working alongside Grid Singularity and Rocky Mountain Institute during the founding days of Energy Web to really build it out properly. And so these companies were Centrica, a publicly traded British multinational electricity and gas services company; Elia Group, which is a transmission system operator that we talked about in the intro with their collaborations on digital IDs with BMW and Energy Web; Shell. I'm sure most people have heard of this one by now. You know, just the fourth largest energy company in the world. Nothing too special, right? Sempra, which is one of the largest utility holding companies in the United States; SP Group, Singapore Power. They're owned by investment fund Temasek, which is owned by the Singapore government. So they're a government-owned energy company, essentially. Equinor, a petroleum company headquartered in Norway, and much like SP Group, they're also government-owned by the government of Norway. Stedin, which is kind of a conglomerate of other energy companies working in just about every part of the industry. TWL, which stands for Technical Works. I'm not going to try and butcher that word because I know there's no way I'm pronouncing it right, but there's the full title of TWL. And they've been working around for over a century supplying all things gas, electricity, heating, cooling, and water. And then last but not least, there's also Tokyo Electric Powers. I'm assuming the name should be pretty self-explanatory for what they do. Basically, they're responsible for things ranging from renewables, start and stop power, aka balancing. And yep, you guessed it. They're also government owned, with the government of Japan owning a little over 55% of the corporation. So all these guys, plus of course Grid Singularity and Rocky Mountain Institute, are the founders of Energy Web. And well, what do we notice? These are all large multi-billion energy infrastructure firms. In fact, some of these are even owned by their respective jurisdictions' governments. And then of course there's Shell, again, the fourth largest energy company in the world, along with multiple multinational government-owned energy corporations, are the founder of Energy Web. Just think about that for a moment. How many other blockchain networks do you know started from a foundation of that level, in addition to having the founding organization continue to grow with members of the same caliber, and in some cases, even larger, more influential players collaborating alongside them? Not many, if any. That should be your answer. Alright, but now that we've covered a pretty good section of the building blocks and foundation that brought them to where they are today, let's look a little further into their team and see what connections to other large entities we can potentially dig up. So in our introduction, we mentioned Jesse Morris, the CEO, and his respective connections to the Energy Web ecosystem. As we mentioned, he had a pretty key role within one of the Energy Web founding phases, being a principal for Rocky Mountain Institute, where his role really ranged in a wide variety, but predominantly focused on things around fundamental economics of batteries, EVs, working with other corporations to build new grid models and solutions, flexibility, and different services on the energy grid. And so to add to that, he was also a co-author for multiple findings on these topics. Many of these findings can be found on the IEEE website, which is the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineering, which is also the world's largest technical professional organization to advancing technology. There's a ton of things that are in their ecosystem, ranging from councils built around biometrics, nanotechnology, RFIDs, sensors, and many more. They're also a standard-setting body with some standards around IoT, cybersecurity, interoperability, wireless networks, circuit breakers, and metal-clad switchgears. So yeah, they do a lot of things. So prior to his time at Rocky Mountain Institute, he was still working around the areas of the energy sector, though some smaller positions and enterprises. Most notably for about 3 years as a researcher for Colorado College on environmental, legal, and political ramifications of global warming in the Arctic. Now let's move on to the tech part of the team with Mani Hag-Sifat, who's the CTO for Energy Web. So during his time beginning at Energy Web, he initially started off as a senior blockchain architect in 2019 and eventually earned the CTO position back in 2021. But prior to this, Manny had built up quite a background in the world of tech. He initially started out as a senior software engineer for Multimedia University for 2 years before spending a year at IBM as their blockchain integration architect. So, always good to see some prior blockchain experience from a CTO, right? Then he spent a solid 9 years at Mimos Berhad, which is a national applied research and development center working alongside the Malaysian Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation. And Mimos has actually been owned by the Malaysian government through their Ministry of Finance since 1996. So Manny really worked in a variety of parts within Mimos, starting out as a senior software engineer for 2 years, then a software and solutions architect for 5 years, and then 2 years as a principal solutions architect, and finally finishing off 2 more years as their head of blockchain labs before joining Oracle. During his 1 year at Oracle, he was their principal cloud platform architect for the areas of blockchain, app development, and mobile services. So overall, quite a strong background with relevant experience in the blockchain and tech space for Manny, both in the private and public sector through IBM and Oracle, along with, of course, Mimos being government owned. Definitely something you want to see out of a CTO of a project of this size, right? Then within the delivery side of the team, we've got Ian Kelly as Energy Web's Director of Global Delivery, where he's responsible for ensuring the Energy Web open source products and integrations are meeting the requirements of the energy sector. And prior to his time at Energy Web, he started off at the US Department of State as an intern, where he analyzed negotiations, organized meetings, along with most notably being a member of the 10th United Nations Congress on the Prevention of Crime and Treatment of Offenders. He then spent about 4 years at Schiff Hardin, which is a national law firm from the US that was founded all the way back in 1864, and his role there was basically in the attorney, corporate, and securities group. He was responsible as a client-facing advisor for companies in energy utility, energy management, IT, private equity, and consumer product industries, along with cross-border transactions with an aggregate value of over $1 billion US. So a lot of similar and relevant experience to what's being built with Energy Web, and I'm sure Ian had really built up his network there. He also spent another 4 years at Northwest University School of Law as an associate director, where he mentored and counseled over 600 lawyers and marketed law school programs. Then his most notable position was spending 4.5 years at Rocky Mountain Institute as a senior associate for just a little under 2 years, and then almost 3 years as their manager. This started from 2014 up until 2018, with the initial work he did before 2018 being focused around product strategy and development for Rocky Mountain Institute's Business Renewable Center. This is basically an initiative to help large corporations around the world enter the renewables market. Today, the Business Renewable Center has been renamed to REBA, short for Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance. And Ian's role for Rocky Mountain Institute after 2018 was largely focused on leading affiliate engagement with the Energy Web Foundation. So quite a perfect transition from Rocky Mountain Institute to Energy Web, which makes perfect sense, being that Rocky Mountain Institute is not only one of the co-founders, but they still technically share the same goals and initiatives with Energy Web. And of course, there's a few more members in the Energy Web team that also share a similar direct path into the ecosystem. So let's take a further look. Amy Westervelt, who's the current senior delivery lead for Energy Web, also shares quite a similar background. She started out her career at Right Stuff BV, which is a Netherlands digital media consulting firm, where she spent about 7 years there from executive assistant to director of content licensing. Then she spent 4.5 years at Rocky Mountain Institute in 2013 as the assistant to the chief scientist for about 4 years, before moving to the program coordinator of Energy Web Foundation for the latter end of her time there. When Amy started out officially at Energy Web, she was largely focused on the affiliate and member engagement side, before eventually moving towards being a director for the regions of the Americas in mid-2021, and finally as the senior delivery lead for them since August of 2022. Now, on the other end, Grid Singularity being another one of the Energy Web co-founders, we also see some direct connections there within the team. Oriel is currently Energy Web's Global Business Development Lead, but prior to this, he was Grid Singularity's Global Business Development Manager. And even before that, he had built up a nice little background around clean energy and blockchain, with mainly InnoEnergy, where he served in multiple positions, ranging from a representative and moderator for some of their events, a manager for some of their teams in the organization, and last but not least, a blockchain specialist and a coordinator for the first online course on blockchain within the energy sector. And the last person we'll cover from the Energy Web team today will be Ioannis Vlachos, who's the commercial director for Energy Web, and he's got a ton of other titles under his belt, so let's take a look at some of his previous experiences. During the start of his career, he initially began at his alma mater Aristotle University at University of Thessaloniki as a PhD for 14 years. In 2018, he also joined the Hellenic Blockchain Hub, which is a blockchain consortium made of members from the public and private sector to help bring further knowledge of blockchain technology to the masses. They're Greek-based, and while not too much information I could find on them, two of their key members are Oracle and SIA. And who else do we know is heavily connected with Oracle and SIA? Well, then after that, he joined the Energy Web Foundation as their commercial director in 2019. Then he spent about 2 semesters or 8 months teaching at the University of Nicosia as an instructor for blockchain and energy. Around this time, he also joined INAPA in early 2020 as a member for their energy working group. And as we know, a lot of other regulated entities and projects in this space are also working within INAPA, right? So that's about it for the Energy Web team that we'll be talking about. But they also have a foundation council where we can see has been validated on the European Commission website, which is of course pretty huge. We can see they're mostly part of Rocky Mountain Institute and Grid Singularity with some highlight-worthy points. Ewald with his position as CEO of Grid Singularity since 2016 and a foundation chair of the Energy Web Foundation. Then John Krates, who recently got moved to CEO of Rocky Mountain Institute in November of 2022. But before that, he was their Chief Strategy Officer and Chief Product Officer from 2012 to 2018. He's also the founder and co-leader of the Rocky Mountain Institute China program. He works with and advises governments, thought leaders, and companies around the world on creating value from using clean energy solutions too. Christopher Frey, who was a senior director at the World Economic Forum from 2001 to 2009, in addition to being the advisor to the president of the Swiss Federal Technical Institute in Lausanne. He was also Secretary General to the World Energy Council. Then there's Eaton, who spent 12 years and counting as the head of research and development and digital innovations. Then Jules Kortenhorst. He spent 9 years as CEO of Rocky Mountain Institute, but before that he was the founding CEO of the Climate Foundation, the largest philanthropic organization for policy development for climate change in Europe. And then even before that, he actually served as a member of the Dutch Parliament for the Christian Democratic Party, along with almost 10 years as Shell's managing director. Jules also currently serves as the Energy Transition Commission on the World Economic Forum's Future Council on Energy. And there's also Anna Trbovic. She's the co-founder and chief operating officer of Grid Singularity. She also serves on the UNECE Carbon Neutrality Board as an advisor. And then lastly, there's Patrick. I believe we've touched up on Patrick's background before in the Casper introduction, where we highlighted he was one of the founding members of the Energy Web Council, and of course also being chairman of the Casper Association. So overall, super interesting to see these connections there, as both Casper and Energy Web are projects we often look into, given their strong fundamentals within their networks and connections. And as you guys can see, Patrick isn't so much like the rest of the Energy Web Foundation Council, with everyone having super close ties to the general energy sector either through Grid Singularity or Rocky Mountain Institute. Patrick's more of a legal expert. He has his own legal firm, PST Legal and Consulting. So it's quite interesting to see someone who's specialized in law with previous experience at places like PwC working so closely within Casper and Energy Web. Being a legal expert, you probably wouldn't attach your name to these projects unless you had a strong sense of confidence in terms of the regulatory compliance, right? But that's about all we'll cover regarding the team and foundation at Energy Web. As you guys can see, not only are they quite well-rounded in different departments and different industry connections, but they have some pretty heavy hitters in their foundation and team with a lot of connections to the founding organizations of Energy Web and different standard-setting bodies such as the World Economic Forum and United Nations. Always good to see those things when researching a DLT project, right? Because as I've said countless times, but I'll say it again, regardless of how you feel about these intergovernmental organizations, these are going to be the guys who dictate the narrative for how the space moves. They've been the ones at the top pulling the strings for a long time now, and it's not likely that crypto coming into place is going to change all that. Let's be real here. And of course, as investors, we got to take all emotions and biases out, especially in such an early blooming industry. But again, that's not any form of financial advice, just kind of life advice. It goes beyond the crypto markets, but even with life, when there's a situation you don't like, don't just act out due to your emotions. Always use logic and reasoning to every decision you make. But enough of me babbling, let's move on. We just looked pretty in depth into their team, and now we also understand the general use cases and roots of the Energy Web ecosystem. So now I think we can start digging through for some connections like we always do. We've already mentioned their foundations backed by the EU Commission through the listing of Energy Web Foundation and their council members right on the EU website, right? which is already huge. But beyond that, there's a few pretty interesting partnerships together. 6 of them to be exact, with the European Union. So let's go over each one of these, as they're all around quite a few different initiatives, but in the end still tie back down to the energy sector. So first off, there's Omega X. The goal of this initiative is to implement a data space for a marketplace infrastructure based on European standards. And within that framework would also include things like data sharing across different network participants for a cross-scalable and easily interoperable space along the energy grid, but also in other industries too. Then when we head onto the Omega X page, we can find all the other participating members in there, like NG, EDF, EnergyWeb, and Blocksmove. The project began in May 2022 and ends in April 2025 with Atos as the consortium leader. Atos does a lot of things around the concepts of advanced computing, analytics, decarbonization, digital consulting, and much more, as you can see here. This project is of course EU funded, much like every one of these projects that we'll be talking about, and it's already seen some progression of pilot phases with places like Germany, Ireland, Italy, and a few other countries. For the second project with the EU, we'll cover Synogenes, which is around energy storage innovations, while focusing on the EU's decarbonization goals. There's a total of 6 components to Synogenes that make up the core of this project, so let's look at each one of these. First off is of course designing and implementing this toolkit for energy storage. Then second, they've got to bring the solutions to various integrated systems and make sure they're all interoperable. Third is to work with and around the regulatory barriers we currently have to explore the requirements of market compliance to allow for the adoption of energy storage and flexibility on the grid. Fourth is demonstrating data-driven dApps for things like data sharing and interoperability in energy storage. Fifth is calculating and analyzing the actual benefits brought by connected energy storage in terms of a technical, environmental, and economic perspective. And then sixth is to create a roadmap to allow the Synogenes toolkit to be developed and ensuring it's compatible to be adopted across all of Europe. And here we can of course see some of the members participating in this initiative, and some of the entities backing it, and of course it's more than just EnergyWeb. We see the EU Commission, of course, is a funding member of this initiative, but then there's also members like Hitachi and various academic and research groups. Now let's move on to Opportunity. This initiative between EnergyWeb and the European Commission with other members is focused on further expanding grid flexibility and interoperability. Some of the focuses within this group will be to integrate an energy-focused blockchain, which of course there's not many of these, and the largest one that we know of is of course EnergyWeb. There's also going to be a total of 13 demonstrations using the framework for Opportunity's ability to stabilize and interconnect the grid together in the countries of Greece, Slovenia, Spain, and Switzerland. The expected impact is about 27,000 citizens, and the goal is to reduce their energy bills by up to 30% while reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 91.22 metric tons of carbon dioxide, along with reducing energy poverty by 30% by 2032. And then there's also Surpass. This is probably my favorite one, and it's pretty much for digital IDs and product passports. Their focus on these digital product passports will initially be towards electronics, batteries, and textiles. So basically, it'll allow for a product's full life cycle of things like where each battery was manufactured, what kind of energy it was charged with through its life cycle, how it was actually created, and more of that sorts. And of course, eventually they'll look to scale this solution, or if not, at the very least, use a rough framework of it out of other sectors and industries as things continue to mature and they start seeing whether it can withstand through a test of time. Of course, the plan for this is to utilize a blockchain for various reasons, from things like the immutability of the data of a product's lifecycle, the truthful verification of identities, ability to keep full record keeping of each identity, and various other reasons. And then here we can also see some of the other members in the Surpass consortium. So they've split it into 2 categories, corporate members and national trade members. Within the corporate members, some notable names are like Accenture, Apple, Amazon, Cisco, Ernst & Young, Google, GSK, ING, MasterCard, Meta, Microsoft, Oracle, SAP, Visa. Now, one really notable one I found here was TikTok, and without getting too controversial, that's because we've heard of all the worries of cybersecurity risks in TikTok with the whole geopolitical talks, right? And with basically the breach of data privacy that they have with their app in their terms of services. So seeing them here listed as a participating member that's going to be helping make digital product passports, I just found that kind of interesting. I don't want to get too controversial and fall down another rabbit hole, so let's just move on and look at some of the national trade members now, as I just wanted to point that out. Within here, there's mainly just organizations in both public and private sectors of Europe. So a lot of these organizations are based in places like Spain, Luxembourg, Denmark, etc. I really didn't look all too far into these participating national trade organizations, but I'd imagine they have some status with the fact that they're in this organization and the fact that these organizations combined make up about 45,000 other companies. So that's saying quite a bit, right? Now, for the final collaboration with Europe in the energy web ecosystem, this one's called Inexus. The purpose of Inexus is to pretty much deploy and integrate energy service tools across various other sectors and industries with tokenized energy efficiency data onto a public blockchain. This project overall has a lot of potential for the adoption of distributed energy resources and clean energy savings overall. As when you think about energy, every sector and industry uses energy. From basic things like keeping the lights and heating on in offices to machinery and overall technology. That's of course all powered by energy. And so the goal for Inexus is to develop models for businesses to integrate smart energy services and sustainable renewables into their industry with ways to communicate and validate the truth in each sector and pretty much see how much energy they're really saving in terms of costs, but also efficiency and how that energy is being generated. This is a project led by the Institute for European Energy and Climate Policy with various members from academia such as University of Athens, legal teams like Enercoup and Verdia Legal, energy infrastructures, and then of course Energy Web. Some of the other tasks in Inexus are like energy performance contracts, which is just an agreement that the energy savings from a potential project such as something like renovations will be financed through the future savings of energy by agreeing to integrate renewables into their infrastructure. And then some other grid management and flexibility services through integrations of distributed energy resources like natural gas and smart EV charging stations. Alright, but that's about all we'll be covering regarding the EU's connection to Energy Web. It's really not often we see a crypto project collaborating with a policymaker as large as the European Union. And of course, we know the European Union also just finalized their MiCA bill not too long ago for a regulatory framework around the crypto industry. So to see Energy Web Foundation continue to be in close works with them throughout all that, well, that's probably a pretty good sign regulatory-wise in terms of how Europe continues to see and collaborate with Energy Web, right? For this next set of connections, we're going to be looking into the Rocky Mountain Institute a little further because, well, they were the founders of Energy Web, and they pretty much have the same initiatives. It's really just a branch out of what they're doing further into the blockchain space. So first off, let's take a look at the donor list to the Rocky Mountain Institute. Of course, we begin to see some pretty massive names from a variety of different industries. We see the Bezos Earth Foundation, Goldman Sachs, United Airlines, Google, FedEx, Amazon, and well, I'm sure you guys get the point. Now, there's a few I really want to focus on here that are from the financial industry, and that's BlackRock, Rockefeller, and JP Morgan. There's a little more going on behind the scenes with these guys beyond just donating to the Rocky Mountain Institute. So let's see how exactly these guys are connected. We'll start with BlackRock. So a lot of you guys have probably seen that one article where BlackRock basically gave Energy Web a shout out when they announced that collaboration with Coinbase, right? If you haven't yet, here's the screenshot. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Back in March of 2021, BlackRock had hired a new lead for their sustainable investment platform. And the name of this new lead is Paul Bodnar. But before Paul had begun his career at BlackRock, he's had quite an interesting background, starting out with a combined 7 years with the US government in his roles at the US Department of State and White House. During his time with the government, his roles were focused around overall climate finance and energy in the lead director role. So that's already saying quite a lot. Then he spent about 5 years as the chief strategy officer and managing director for none other than the Rocky Mountain Institute from 2016 to 2021. And keep in mind, it was around this time from 2016 to 2020 where the initial concepts of Energy Web had gradually begun to grow out into the vision of what it is today. And of course, Paul's time there exactly lines up and with the fact he was holding such a significant role for them. Something really tells me he had a key role in the developments of Energy Web during the early days. And I just wanted to drop a reminder as to why it's so important to look back at Rocky Mountain Institute, Grid Singularity, and all these other founders of Energy Web, but especially those two. Now, on Paul's resume, we also see he was a founding chair of the Center for Climate Aligned Finance, which is a consortium that was established by the Rocky Mountain Institute to help the financial sector transition the financial industry toward a net zero carbon future. Some of the other founding members in here are like Bank of America, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and Wells Fargo's. Some of the other strategic members then involved CIBC, Citi, TD Bank, RBC, ING, the United Nations Environmental Programs Finance Initiative, Hewlett Foundation, which is an HP-founded organization, and then other energy corporations. So again, pretty massive to see the Rocky Mountain Institute working so closely with all these financial giants. And of course, these close connections to Rocky Mountain Institute only make the connections of Energy Web even stronger. Though the BlackRock and Energy Web connections don't end there. The Rocky Mountain Institute also has a collaboration with Energy Web on Sustainable Aviation Fuel Certificate Registry, utilizing the Energy Web's tech stack. And here we can see the founding members of the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance here, which is an organization of members working to accelerate the development of sustainable aviation fuels in terms of certificates, education on sustainable aviations, and other tech innovations. So the founding members in this organization, as we can see, are pretty big names, right? And it's not just energy companies. In fact, it's a huge mix of companies in banking, tech, consultancy, and more, with massive names like JP Morgan, Meta, Boeing, Deloitte, Salesforce, Netflix, Bank of America, Microsoft, as all the founding organization members, Engie as an advisor, and of course, Energy Web as the technology provider. So over the course of an aircraft's life cycle, it's expected that an aircraft could save up to 80% in emissions by using this solution. Another adopter of sustainable aviation fuels is Avalia, which is created with Energy Web through the collaborations with Shell, Accenture, and American Express to create a blockchain-based system allowing for fully traceable sustainable aviation fuel purchases, in which they're working on a method to have corporate travelers to use Avalia's booking and claiming system to purchase shares of sustainable fuels for their flight, and in return, the environmental benefits of these purchases are then recorded in the company's favor. This has benefits for everyone. Airlines access the buying power of corporations for sustainable aviation fuel needs, while companies can use the traceable attributes Avalia provides to meet their own sustainability targets and one day include them as part of the corporate reporting. So, who else has adopted the Sustainable Aviation Fuels Certificate Framework? Well, in June of 2021, the World Economic Forum had collaborated with Rocky Mountain Institute and PricewaterhouseCoopers, where they created an insight report together for the World Economic Forum's Clean Skies for Tomorrow initiative, in which we can see tons of other large members from various industries in here. As we can see, this framework for sustainable aviation fuel credits are not only being collaborated on by some of the largest companies in the world, but they've confirmed that they'll be building the infrastructure of these technologies with the Energy Web decentralized operating system. And perhaps the biggest connection here once again comes from BlackRock, which they're adopting this framework and supporting it with this partnership alongside guys like Deloitte, Microsoft, United Airlines, Boeing, etc. in purchasing these sustainable aviation credits. But next, let's move on to their connections regarding some of the history between Rocky Mountain Institute and the Rockefellers. For anyone unaware of the Rockefellers, while less talked about today, they were at one point the richest family in the world, with John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil owning 90% of all the oil in the US at one point. Just think about that, owning 90% of all the oil in the United States. Forget about the value and financial part of that for a second. That's just a lot of oil, and of course, in return, a lot of power and control. So here we can see the Rockefeller Foundation has actually been a donor to the Rocky Mountain Institute on a variety of occasions. And it overall totals up to about $3.34 million US towards a bunch of different initiatives that Rocky Mountain Institute had looked to funding for. These range from projects for state solutions, setting up an office and building out projects to expand in China, and some other climate finance programs. And then if we look a little further into the Rockefellers page, we actually see another donation to fund the Rocky Mountain Institute of $5 million towards climate and energy. Some interesting stuff for sure, but there's a little more with Energy Web founder Shell. The Rockefellers have also had a collaboration with Shell for accelerating energy access in Africa. And well, it just so happens that one of the projects building on Energy Web is for this exact purpose. And this is with Engie, a multinational energy utilities company headquartered in France, where the two of them are going to be using DeFi to help accelerate the energy access in sub-Saharan Africa through crowdfunding with decentralized finance. Engie is already a leader in off-grid pay-as-you-go solar and microgrid providers in Africa. So having Energy Web work with them just helps that much more with not only establishing Energy Web, but also with helping Engie in expanding and keeping their growth as a leader for energy access in Africa even stronger. And the coolest part about this partnership is that Energy Web community members actually got to play a role in this initiative, where if you stake your Energy Web tokens, you'd get a fixed return through a lease-as-you-own model. So it's cool to see that through a community, you can actually help play your role in doing some good for the world. But that's what we'll cover regarding the BlackRock and Rockefeller connections. Let's move on a little further now. So one of the things we mentioned during our coverage of former Rocky Mountain Chief Strategy Officer and current BlackRock's Head of Sustainability was that he had some connections to the US government, right? Well, this is a pretty interesting situation, as of course we know that Energy Web has largely been focused towards building solutions that are mostly around Europe so far, with little bits of pieces in other regions such as the Asia Pacific. And while since they were founded out of Switzerland, it kind of makes sense, but of course Rocky Mountain Institute is based in Colorado, United States. So there's actually been various ties between the US government and Rocky Mountain Institute on some forms of collaboration for sustainability. Now, before we do get into this end of the connections, I would like to point out that while a lot of this information I dug up myself, much of all this is possible thanks to some of the work from the guys in the Energy Web community's research that they've put together on crypto Twitter. Some of these guys are like Gator Green, Neo Lawyer, Ardian, and Jaron. So yeah, if you guys are watching this, the work you guys is much appreciated from the communities in ways words can't describe. And for everyone else, be sure to check out their podcast series titled Caught in the Energy Web on Spotify after this deep dive if you'd like to catch more Energy Web content. But alright, back to the connections. So this doesn't just consist of various connections to the White House, but rather various, and I mean various other large entities through this one rabbit hole, as you guys are about to see. This begins with Rocky Mountain Institute's Supply Chain Emissions Initiative, and we already know the issues with the supply chain emissions, right? It should be a no-brainer at this point. I mean, every day we're seeing tons of cargo ships, freight trucks, and trains, endless paper, and much more to fuel this industry through its daily tasks. And through projects like XDC and Morpheus Network, we've already talked about some of the innovations to bring automation and digitalize trading. But that's not quite enough for truly reducing the carbon emissions in supply chains. One of the main initiatives in here is called COMET, which stands for Coalition on Materials Emissions Transparency. This project was initially founded in 2020 during the World Economic Forum's Davos event, with some other founding members of the alliance being members like MIT Sustainability Supply Chain Initiative, Columbia Center for Sustainable Investment, and the Colorado School of Mines. So that's already saying quite a bit with that level of academic backing, right? The goal of it is to pretty much work towards building a standard framework for greenhouse gas calculations towards mineral and industrial supply chains. But let's quickly jump back to the overall Rocky Mountain Institute Supply Chain Emissions Initiative, as COMET is just one part of this. Within the page for their listed initiatives, we see that one point of focus here that's toward digital infrastructure and exchanges. In the description, what do we see? Improving emissions accuracy by working with the Energy Web Foundation to create a blockchain platform that will digitally track emissions through a supply chain. Huh, that's interesting, isn't it? Of course, we figured Rocky Mountain Institute would continue to collaborate with Energy Web, but to see it directly listed as a key goal in their supply chain emissions initiative is pretty massive. And well, if you kind of think about it, improving emission accuracy with Energy Web for a blockchain platform, well, doesn't that align pretty much perfectly with what they're trying to work on with COMET? As a blockchain could hypothetically give you all the transparent insights to the data from the mineral and industry supply chain side of things. And then to add to this, a while back earlier on this initiative, there was actually a job listing on UN Jobs for a manager on sustainability of supply chains, where the goal for this position was literally to work with building out the frameworks for COMET with a focus on blockchain integration. Interesting, right? Now, let's look on the side of things with the White House briefly. They have their own mission titled the Clean Buy Task Force, which is focused towards clean manufacturing by using more low carbon emission materials, investments in clean steel, cement, and aluminum, and increasing production for EVs, solar panels, and wind turbines. Rocky Mountain Institute had actually posted about this, pretty much showing their support and saying that they're working towards similar goals, which of course is likely referring to COMET. And well, in one of their comments below, they actually mentioned that they're officially using Energy Web with their partners for this mission. So by now, I'm sure you guys are kind of seeing the connections here. But that's just the start of it. While there's no direct confirmations between COMET and the White House's Clean Buy Task Force, Rocky Mountain Institute previously wrote a letter to the US Security and Exchange Commission on climate change as per Biden's executive order. Here we see the mentions of the G7 in addition to data management and collection of carbon productivity metrics. Again, we gotta read between the lines here. It doesn't mention COMET whatsoever, but what's COMET's goal again? Data for tracking mineral and industrial supply chains, right? So yeah, definitely some interesting ties going on there, and one that really isn't mentioned quite as much, largely due to the attention to detail that's required to actually see what's going on in this. And that's what the big guys want, right? They use all this jargon and various other terms to try and confuse regular everyday participants from really seeing what's developing with blockchain technology. But there's one more line of connections to the White House I wanted to briefly cover before we move on to the next line of connections within the Energy Web. So this report was actually somewhat recent. Well, I guess if you want to call September 2022 recent, which was about 5 or 6 months ago now. Wow. Time's really going by fast. But this report back in September was actually focused on the climate and energy implications of crypto assets, which of course has kind of been a big point of focus for a while now, with the energy consumption of Bitcoin mining and previously Ethereum while it was on proof of work. Obviously, I'm not going to break down the entire report for you guys, as one, you guys probably have heard of these climate FUD points way too much by now, and two, it's really not information that all directly ties into the Energy Web. So instead, I'll show you guys why and what things in this document are actually relevant to Energy Web. So first off, right in the table of contents, we can see this one section that's titled Emerging Digital Asset Technologies Could Support Climate Monitoring or Mitigation. Again, read between the lines there. Climate monitoring or mitigation. Well, with the data provenance of energy certificates on Energy Web, in addition to their focus on distributed energy resource integration with various other industry players, those points line up pretty well, don't they? And then right below that, blockchain as enabling technology for distributed energy resources. Don't think I really need to explain this one. Energy Web is probably one of, if not one of the largest players in the energy and renewable space when it comes to blockchain. Another hint towards connections to Energy Web is in this specific paragraph, where they highlight California's Flex Alert system, which is in short a voluntary public program to reduce electricity use during specific critical hours that's being leveraged by the California Independent System Operator. This was not only mentioned, but was also quoted and referenced within the paper. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory had written a report on pretty much how Energy Web's EWT could be leveraged for more cost-effective and reliable and scalable markets when it comes to transactive energy. And this wasn't like a one-time mention in the article or anything. They literally mentioned the Energy Web Foundation various times in addition to the EWT with heavy detail on their components and use cases. Now, let's flip the script a little and talk about standards, because that's always super important when looking into regulated utility, right? So of course we know that Energy Web has done some very close work with the IREC standards in terms of having even built out marketplaces for these certificates. And these IREC marketplaces they've collaborated on are the ones for Southeast Asia, Japan and Thailand with PTT, Turkey with Photon, and El Salvador with Mercedes Electric. But there's another standard they're working with, the DREC initiative, which stands for the Distributed Renewable Energy Certificates. And they're basically working to be a new market instrument going towards driving further investments in the distributed renewable energy sector through verifiable claims of the purchase of renewable energies. So to better explain this, I'll walk you guys through a step-by-step of how DRECs work. So firstly, say a solar device gets installed by a local registered provider. Then of course renewable energies are generated, and they can also be tracked this way. The performance of the generation is then monitored and verified by an issuing body of DRECs. These issuing bodies then certify whether the energy complies with standards. Next, corporate buyers will purchase these DRECs that are issued from an international environmental market. Then finally, the revenues from these DRECs will flow back to the providers, in return giving communities much more affordable clean energy. And as you guys can see here, the Energy Web chain is actually used as part of the data tracing of DRECs. Now, next up, let's actually take a look at some members within the DREC initiative. Firstly, we'll highlight the United Nations, which actually have a direct partnership with South Pole for building out the operations of the DREC initiative. As of course, the DREC initiative perfectly aligns with their sustainable development goals. The Shell Foundation, which again is not only an Energy Web founding corporation, but also one of the largest companies in the world, is also a member in here. Along with that, we also see various other companies in energy and IoT, such as Vodafone, TEPCO, Engie, IREC Foundation, which is of course the other side of renewable energy certificates Energy Web is working with. And we also see various other organizations around the world, such as the World Bank, US, Swiss, and UK agencies for international development, and some more. So yeah, just like with IREC standards, a ton of backing, though a good mix of private and public sector support from DRECs versus IRECs, which have mostly been public sector based. One very notable connection to DREC, specifically to South Pole, which is one of the co-leaders in driving the DREC initiative, is Process Group. This is one of the largest tech investing companies in the world, owning 30% of Tencent and working alongside some really big companies like Udemy, Auto Traders, Code Academy, Remitly, and many others. So Process is collaborating with South Pole to buy 3 gigawatt hours of DRECs from South Pole between 2022 to 2025, equaling out to about 1 gigawatt hour per year. And while with all the tech companies Process Group works alongside with, this partnership to buy up these RECs seemed like a pretty good path towards adoption for South Pole, and of course the technical infrastructure they're building these certificates on in Energy Web Chain. And then in this graphic, we can see some other large members such as Google, Mitsubishi, World Economic Forum, and many others that are all behind the DREC initiative. The last point I'll add to DREC is this document here, which as we can see is from South Pole Blockchain Bureau, which is a Liechtenstein-based company focused on news and information on blockchain, and then Climate Ledger Initiative, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative on climate and digital innovations. So the purpose of this document is focused around real-world use cases assessed under the Liechtenstein Token and TT Service Provider Act. And so before we continue, where else have we heard about Liechtenstein before? Well, during our LCX deep dive, right? From that, we not only know that LCX has various certified licenses for digital asset operations legally in Liechtenstein, but Liechtenstein also probably has some of the clearest rules and regulations set to try and draw in the industry-grade blockchain adoption. And the regulatory framework that this operation for DREX in Liechtenstein is of course following that same regulatory framework. Inside the document, we can actually find various hints relating to what we discuss from REX, specifically DREX, the TVTG Act, and of course Energy Web, in which it actually states that the organizations setting DREX have tested various ways to integrate the system and found Energy Web to be the best fit for the job, meeting all their expectations and needed capabilities. With mentions of Energy Web Origin also playing a key role in development of building out DREX. Additionally, in the token generator section, it states that Energy Web will be one of the companies providing these services. And then of course, various of these licenses mention on potential TVTG acts that may be relevant to operate with full functioning DREX are also ones we've previously discussed on regarding what they do, such as token depository, token issuer, and most recently a physical validator, which is focused on validating a physical object between that and their counterpart. So who knows? Maybe we'll see something like REX validated on Energy Web able to trade on LCX by institutions one day down the line. Then, on the other hand, we have this document from the United Nations Environment Program on the development of blockchain for sustainable energy and climate. In here we see a variety of things, not just Energy Web, but there's also some IOTA and Power Ledger, another energy company building in DLT. Now before we go further, one thing I wanted to highlight here was where they listed Energy Web. They also listed their partners alongside them in the Energy Web section. And of course, the partners listed here are their contributing members for various IREC marketplaces that we mentioned not too long ago, such as Photon, PTT, and Mercedes Electric. The rest of the members and contributors in this report are largely UN-focused members with a strong background in tech and energy. For example, we'll take Benjamin Simmons, who spent the past 18 years with the United Nations Environment Program climbing the ranks from legal officer in trade, policy and planning, up to the coordinator for ecosystem and biodiversity, and then since 2012, he's been the head secretariat on green growth partnerships. Now, I won't go over the full document as it's a variety of different topics in here, but the main highlights in here in regards to Energy Web Origin is being highlighted as a solution for blockchain-based renewables. Now, let's touch up a little on one last connection within the Energy Web ecosystem before we carry on with tokenomics. So we've spent the bulk of this video talking about clean energy, renewables, distributed energy resources. And so what's one of the biggest pieces of this transition that we see in our everyday lives? Electric vehicles, of course. With the rise in popularity of various car manufacturers beginning to make the shift, we're seeing EVs becoming more and more mainstream with the goal to fight off carbon emissions in addition to just overall sustainability and cost effectiveness. And while, of course, we discussed a lot of what Elia Group and BMW was doing with Energy Web in the introduction, so I won't go too in depth into that. The TLDR is essentially that whenever a BMW electric vehicle is plugged into one of the charging stations that utilizes Elia's energy through them being a system operator, they're able to get a full life cycle data of each specific electric vehicle that's plugged in, from the energy they're using to charge, the mileage, the identities registered to the car, etc. But there's a potentially bigger company that's at the forefront of electric vehicles, the one that's arguably the face of this industry. Of course, I'm talking about Tesla. Tesla really needs no introduction, as if you haven't heard of Tesla at this point, you really must be spending too much time diving down the rabbit hole. So, while there's no official partnership between the two, I just want to point that out first, it's clear that both parties' initiatives are pretty similar, and while to say there's some overlap between these guys' operations would be quite an understatement. So let's dive into a few of these connections between the two that may potentially show some work behind the scenes. So Tesla has this software called AutoBidder. Essentially what it does is allows for energy trading using machine learning to become optimized through continuously executing transactions based on an algorithm model set by human operators. So you can think of this as like a trading desk or trading bot, except for energy trading. But what does this have to do with Energy Web in any way? Well, Energy Web actually has something similar of their own in terms of an automating financial transactions when it comes to buying and selling renewable energy. And this solution is called the Decentralized Autonomous Area Agent, or the D3A for short. This is actually a solution that's built by Grid Singularity and runs on the Energy Web chain. And here we can see a few tweets from Grid Singularity and Edward Heath, who is the CEO of Grid Singularity and one of the foundation members of Energy Web. And they literally tagged Tesla in these showcases of their showing of D3A, pretty much proving that they're working towards the same goals of an automated energy trading market with the proper parameters set and the overlap between the two. So pretty interesting stuff right there. It doesn't really make sense why Grid Singularity and a foundation member of Energy Web would randomly be tagging Tesla and mentioning auto bidders in this context, unless there might be some consideration for collaboration, or who knows, maybe it's already happened and we just don't know it yet. And then there was this interview with Grid Singularity and Energy Web Foundation co-founder Anna Trebovic, where she was asked about Tesla.
Because when we are talking about blockchain technology, Tesla is coming to Berlin as well, as I read in the newspapers.
It's already there. It's already there.
And Elon Musk is also very much into the blockchain technology. When I read his Twitter feed, maybe we have in 1 or 2 years a tweet from Elon Musk about Grid Singularity. That would be a thing.
Well, it would be a natural fit because they are thinking ahead. So they have already created, they have enabled their cars to participate in energy markets by developing the auto bidder software. Therefore, if there is an energy community that implements a local electricity market with peer-to-peer and community trading, those vehicles can trade as well. And they're ready for that moment. So once we go from MVP to commercial, they will easily integrate. And I believe that other EV manufacturers will follow the same path. We are promoting this development, and all of these energy assets, and a car is an energy asset, in the future will come with their own trading strategies. And there are companies, other startups that we collaborate with that are aiming to optimize such strategies to make the trading smarter for your solar panel or your car or another asset.
Notice how she stutters describing this. This sounds a lot like someone who's stuttering because they gotta be careful with what they can say so they don't release private information. And notice how she says, once they move from MVP to commercial, they will easily integrate in regards to electric vehicles integrating onto Energy Web's tech stack. She didn't say they can or they could easily integrate, but rather they will easily integrate. And then finishing it off with saying she believes other EV manufacturers will follow the same path. Now, of course, that's absolutely not any form of confirmation, but it is pretty interesting to see how all this lines up as of now. Though, of course, there's quite a lot more. Let's look on Tesla's end a little further. In May of 2021, Tesla had also partnered with Kryha, a Web3 company that's focused on product and ecosystem development. The partnership between these two, they're utilizing one of Kryha's solutions called Resource, in which the utility from this is using blockchain to trace the raw materials, especially cobalt, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, that's being used in EV batteries to ensure they're truly sustainably sourced. Resource was founded by 3 major Democratic Republic of Congo producers in Glencore, which is $132 billion in total assets, China Molybdenum Co., which is second largest cobalt producer in the world, and Eurasian Resources Group, which is 40% owned by the Kazakhstan government. And then of course Kryha is the technology provider for all this. So as we can see, pretty massive backing for Resource. And so now we know what Tesla is working with to trace the identities and origins of these batteries, in addition to them actually being one of the non-founding participants that help with implementing and designing the solution. Now to see how it all connects into the energy web. To begin, Kryha has worked with one of the energy web founding companies in Shell for creating digital IDs for product passports, and this video by Shell basically highlights what they did. And not only do we know about these solutions for product passports with RFIDs and QR codes in Surpass, but with product passports and IDs, that's of course one of the main functions of Energy Web in utilizing digital identities. As we can see in the Energy Web GitHub, there's various solutions that do utilize these, and for those who are thinking, well, how are you so sure it's Energy Web and not something else that may not even be a blockchain? Well, remember in Shell's video how they directly mentioned the use of an open source blockchain for the initiative of digital product passports? Well, what other blockchain would they use? Maybe Hyperledger, but that probably isn't likely due to the closed nature of many of their products and modules. And to add to that, Shell being a founding member of Energy Web, it kind of makes sense for them to utilize the Energy Web platform, right? Also, Tesla isn't the only renewable energy innovator that Kryha has worked with. They've also collaborated with Energy Web on a few different goals together. We'll first start off with the Global Battery Alliance. This is a public-private collaborative platform founded by the World Economic Forum back in 2017 and brings together non- and intergovernmental organizations, industry players, and research academias to really maximize battery efficiency through its life cycle. And so to do that, they'll of course have to issue individual batteries a battery passport to track the performance, of the batteries through its life cycle. The technology they'll be using for this is CRYHA's resource for the batteries' IDs. Now, you may remember earlier on we were discussing about the EU's partnerships with Energy Web, and one of them was also focused towards this exact goal of giving batteries, electronics, and textiles digital identities. Of course, this is Surpass we're talking about. So we already know Surpass will be using the EWT for the technology infrastructure. But then as we check the Global Battery Alliance website, we see right here that Surpass is actually also mentioned alongside its affiliated initiatives. Which again, when you think about it, makes a lot of sense, right? These two are both going towards the same fundamental goals of digital IDs for battery assets. One thing also worth mentioning is that this isn't the only battery management project Energy Web has been a part of. They've also previously worked with Fluvius on EasyBat for battery lifecycle management, which Jesse Morris had already mentioned is also connected to the Global Battery Alliance to scale out the solutions globally. So now we have 1. CRYHA is collaborating with Tesla on battery passports through their solution resource, which Tesla had a part in building. 2. CRYHA is also working alongside Shell and Energy Web on a similar initiative. 3. CRYHA's resource has also been used in a pilot for battery IDs in the Global Battery Alliance. And 5. The Global Battery Alliance is also working alongside Surpass, which is of course one of the EU and Energy Web collaborations. These are all very similar, if not identical solutions, with the general purpose of all these initiatives being data provenance of the conditions and statuses of these battery assets and identities in real time. But again, that doesn't guarantee they're working together whatsoever. So let's continue digging down the rabbit hole. Now let's look into virtual power plants. These are essentially comprised of hundreds or thousands of households and businesses that offer the latent potential of their thermostats, electric vehicles, appliances, batteries, heat pumps, and solar arrays to support the grid. These devices can be flexibly charged, discharged, or managed to meet grid needs. When these devices are aggregated and coordinated, they can provide many of the same energy services as a traditional power plant. Put simply, it aggregates distributed energy resources into a single coordinated unit to provide services to the energy grid like flexibility. For example, let's say during peak summer season, a distributed set of electric vehicle batteries and wind turbines could shift their demand over to reduce the grid load of demand during the hot summer day, as everyone's probably blasting their air conditioners, and that's where the priority probably is, right? Well, of course, Rocky Mountain Institute, being a pioneer in innovations to the energy sector, especially with decarbonization, they decided to launch the Virtual Power Plant Partnership, or VP3 for short. So some of the other founding members in here that we see are like Ford, Google Nest, General Motors, and Ohm Connect. Now, if we actually dig into the VP3 document presented by Rocky Mountain Institute, we can find that one of the founders, Ohm Connect, has this little section where they also mention California Independent System Operator, calling on all available resources to match supply and demand during the heat wave, which is of course referring to the Flex Alert system that leverages part of the Energy Web for things like digital identities. As we can see here, it says that these resources included virtual power plants are managed by Ohm Connect, Tesla, Sunrun, and various other companies, with some of them being other founding members of the VP3. So again, interesting to see another mention of Tesla here, which we know in some way leverages the Energy Web chain, as Tesla's virtual power plants are used in the Flex Alert system. But things may still seem a little fuzzy between how these two are actually connected. As we just mentioned, Tesla is a participating member of California Independent System Operators Flex Alert for their virtual power plants to power the grid. Well, all of CAISO's participants are required to have a registered digital identity for platform operations, along with data privacy and communication. And well, where does CAISO leverage these digital identities? You guessed it, Energy Web Chain. So while you could argue it's more of a back-end function kind of connection, from the other lines we've drawn, it's pretty interesting with how these two are kind of indirectly working together towards the same goals on multiple occasions. But that's not all. Back in 2021, there was also a presentation by Energy Web demonstrating the digital infrastructure to make it possible for customer-owned assets to enroll and participate in coordinated grid operator systems. And so of course, this is a reference to the Flex alerts in addition to other small initiatives of theirs. But what do we see here? California system operator up on the operation layer, and then Tesla on the customer and asset layer, which is exactly what the connection we just mentioned is all about. Now, there's also SunSpec Alliance, which is focused on a plug-and-play system providing interoperability within distributed energy resources and standards around that topic. The alliance is made of a variety of players within the industry, with some examples like Caterpillar, General Electric Company, Korea Testing Laboratory, LG, Shell, Sonnen, Wells Fargo, and of course, Tesla. We already know that Energy Web and SunSpec are working together for digital protocols, standards, solutions, and certificates around solar panels and battery energy storage, which, as you guessed, uses the Energy Web chain. So again, these initiatives all line up to what Energy Web has already been doing with multiple parties in regards to the virtual power plants and Flex alerts, along with the goals they have for the SunSpec Alliance. To add a little cherry on top, we can also see this picture of a Tesla on their data exchange page, which I think may be a little strange unless they had some form of collaboration with Tesla to be using their car in the display. I mean, they're also working with other car manufacturers within EVs like BMW and Volkswagen, right? They could have used one of those cars, but no. They chose to put a Tesla out there. And then we look here in the Energy Web's GitHub page from the Digital ID Registry. And what do we find? Tesla Model 3. Well, that's kind of interesting. Now, to wrap up this line of connections with some interpersonal connections between the two entities, meet Mario Pavlovich. From October 2018 to December 2020, he was the product owner and director of product management for Energy Web. And then in December 2020, pretty much right when he resigned his time at Energy Web, he joined as one of Tesla's staff engineers, but not just any engineer, but one of Tesla's 25 guns. Now, most of you guys are probably wondering, what in the world are the 25 guns, and what do they have to do with Tesla? The 25 Guns is a select 25-person engineering task force formed by Elon Musk himself to fix Tesla Gigafactory in Berlin. And, of course, these 25 Guns aren't just randomly chosen engineers. They all had to demonstrate exceptional skill and leadership, in addition to probably keeping a pretty good relationship with Elon. And then here, we can also see a tweet by Energy Web strategic advisor Walter Koch, basically referencing Elon Musk's plan to sell electricity in Texas and turning homes into distributed power plants, and then tagging Energy Web and referencing the EWT. And we also see Mario actually comment "power to the people" below in the replies, which is quite interesting, as we see he had commented this about 9 months since his departure from Energy Web to Tesla. Now, to wrap up this massive rabbit hole between Energy Web and Tesla that we just dove down, I'll share this photo of some Energy Web members in front of a Tesla building. There's no actual context to this image whatsoever. They could have had a business meeting inside, or they could have just been walking by and wanted to get a nice little team photo. Who knows, but make of that what you will. So with all these both direct and third-party connections between Energy Web and Tesla on pretty much identical initiatives, I don't think it's a question whether they both know or acknowledge each other anymore. They definitely do. But the real question is rather how deeply connected these two may be behind the scenes. Of course, we don't have a direct answer to that, but based on the connections seen here, I've got to say, things seem to be getting pretty serious between the two of them. What do you guys think about the links between Tesla and Energy Web? Be sure to let me know in the comments below. But enough about the connections, let's move on to some brief tokenomics. So in the introduction, we already went over some of the general tokenomics in terms of distribution, amount of tokens, and use cases, like for settling energy-based transactions, functions on the Energy Web chain, and a means of rewards for helping with the energy grid. But there's more to this, and instead of me explaining it, I'm gonna let Energy Web CEO Jesse Morris explain the functions of Energy Web staking on the Consortia Relay chain.
And that's where the token comes in. So basically, here's how it's going to look. That staking token at the top of the Consortia Relay chain, it's going to be Energy Web token. So we're not creating a new kind of token to replace EWT or anything like that. So Energy Web token is going to be over here on the mainnet Energy Web chain for now, but that's going to be the token that's used to participate in the governance and to power these relay chain. So if you're going to be a validator up there, you're going to have to stake a lot of Energy Web tokens. But the real interesting stuff happens at this solution level. So if I'm the way the simple token economics works is if I'm a real world enterprise and I want to buy one of these solutions that I've described. So I want to go buy one of them. In, again, Kusama or Polkadot speak, this would be, I'm going to go lease a parachain slot, right? That's how it works over there with these crowd loans. In our sense, we're creating an environment where companies can pay fiat, and that fiat revenue gets flipped into something that looks like a stable coin on the consortia relay chain. That stable coin flows from the company who's paying for one of these solutions into the relay chain. And then this is where it gets super interesting, and we're doing something that I don't think I've ever seen in another crypto project. That payment that flows into the relay chain is split. Part of the payment just gets paid out as an award to the validators on that relay chain because they're performing this service. Makes sense. The other part of that payment is going to be used to automatically acquire Energy Web tokens off of public exchanges and stake them to the relay chain.
Nice.
So, and that to me is incredibly interesting because we're creating a direct channel from enterprise adoption of this Web3 stack that flows straight into the validators, but also the token. And there's a very strong business reason for that. The more tokens are staked into that relay chain off of the open market, the more secure that relay chain is, and by extension, the more secure every solution and every identity that's used.
As you heard, pretty interesting stuff. And the consortia relay chains are a big part of adoption in the Energy Web ecosystem, with it allowing enterprises to build their own sovereign blockchains. And as Jesse said, the main token for the consortia relay chains in terms of staking will be Energy Web token, where each of these relay chains could be different energy services offered in each individual relay chain. But of course, with the whole enterprise approach, they can't be using EWT tokens on the front end, as that's probably a pretty big red flag for most businesses until there's more regulatory clarity and stability within the markets. So it'll all be settled in fiat on the front end, while a stablecoin-like asset is purchased on the back end, then split across validators for the relay chain validators, while another portion of the payments will be used to buy up EWT from public exchanges and directly stake them to the relay chain to further secure the network, which to me personally is such a great use case of tokenomics and staking, because this directly ties the additional security and value incentives of staking to the level of enterprise adoption on Energy Web. Now, the cool thing about staking the Energy Web token is that unlike many of the other projects that probably don't even have a real business reason to be staked, there's multiple pools where you can stake your EWT and not only be rewarded, but have those tokens staked provide real world use cases on certain occasions. So in the most recent screenshot I took on the Energy Web staking page, there were 3 campaigns. There was the Green Proofs, Gold and Silver, and Consortia Relay Chain. So for Green Proofs, you're pretty much staking for securing Energy Web solutions, and there'll also be wallet snapshots taken at random periods to check for users that are consistently staking, which will get Green Proof verifiable credentials, which will reward them in the future by permission to run a Green Proof node, which is something they've got in the plans for this year in 2023. There's also a Gold and Silver staking, which, as you guys can see, says coming soon. And pretty much if you're included in the Energy Web 4 and 5 snapshots by staking, then you can join the Silver pool when it launches. And if you're in all the snapshots, you'll be eligible for the Gold pool. Of course, with the Gold pool probably giving out some additional rewards. And then we of course just previously mentioned the use cases of staking on the Consortia Relay Chain with the whole fiat conversion, which again, in my opinion, is one of the coolest real solutions that's created by staking that I've seen yet. Now there's one other part to the tokenomics of Energy Web that we won't get into in this deep dive, as this is worth another whole video in its own, but I did want to briefly highlight it, and this is the Energy Web Block Explorer. So there's of course the regular Energy Web Block Explorer page, But one of the Energy Web community members, Jaron, had actually made an Energy Web block explorer that was directly built for the community with things like specified wallets such as exchanges, founding wallets, affiliates, etc. all listed out. So it makes for tracking things like we did in the Quant and LCX deep dive much easier. Again, we'll dive down that rabbit hole and look into some of the transactions and connections in a near future video, but that's about all we've got for this video in terms of the Energy Web deep dive. Now, as always, let's wrap it up with my final thoughts. So overall, Energy Web is probably one of the projects with the most connections and use cases already within their ecosystem. Having their founding organization be from some large names and companies like Rocky Mountain Institute, Grid Singularity, Shell, Singapore Power Group, TEPCO, and more already gives it a massive moat along with their foundation members. There's just so much backing behind them in terms of standard setting bodies and large enterprises already, which of course is a huge plus, especially with the current regulatory landscape. Of course, the connections and projects within the Energy Web Foundation is already massive. We can see the backing they have in their validator page along with the various connections they got going on, but also internally within their foundation council and team, we see tons of massive connections back to their founders, Grid Singularity and Rocky Mountain Institute, along with other standard-setting bodies like the United Nations and the World Economic Forum. From how they've been working alongside IREX and DREX to their connections to some massive entities in terms of operations, either directly or through third party like Tesla, the US government, BlackRock, etc. If I'm being real, this is probably one of the few projects that I put up there with Quant in terms of how much trust I have in the project. Obviously, every project I bring and talk about on here, I have a strong level of trust for. But as you guys know, Quant, of course, is on another level for me, with its validation from guys like SIA, LackChain, the European Union, Oracle, MIT, the IETF, etc. And well, I can pretty confidently say Energy Web is right up there for me in terms of the backing and validation I have for it, which of course in return strengthens my overall trust in the overall project. So to quickly recap, here are some highlight points from this video that I personally found the most eye-opening in my time making this. 1. The amount of connections through Rocky Mountain Institute, Grid Singularity, and other founding partners. It's not often you see projects founded by organizations like these. 2. Just the overall amount of entities and projects they're building alongside, from public sector initiatives like Comet and the EU programs, to the Sustainable Aviation Alliance, and of course, the Tesla connections. I also found the history behind Rocky Mountain Institute really interesting. Amaury really was a true pioneer and has really led the way for pretty much everything happening in the industry today. 4. The overall connections within the DREC and IREC initiatives, with Energy Web's role being a tech service provider, I think is going to play a really large role in the future. And of course, the different IREC marketplaces that they're already developing. I think that's just going to continue down the line. And 5. The tokenomics and utility behind the operation, such as staking and having that simple fiat to crypto conversion, is of course massive for future enterprise adoption. And of course, that's paired with their partnership with R3, which we mentioned in the introduction for settling transactions. R3's founding is actually very similar to Energy Web's, in addition to them being one of the largest, if not the largest, fintech DLT company in this space. So having that connection is definitely worth mentioning again. But that's about all I've got for you guys in this video. As always, I hope everyone got some great value out of this, whatever it may be. And I also just wanted to point out that putting all this information on the Energy Web took me a good 2 months of just researching, organizing, and editing. So firstly, apologies for the delay, and secondly, it'd really mean a lot if you guys would leave a like and subscribe along with some feedback, as I really wanted to make this deep dive as perfect as I possibly could. And of course, if you guys are hungry for more DLT research content, remember to hit up Tokenicer.network for all my content platforms right in one spot. For my Twitter threads, Instagram, Spotify, podcasts, Telegram, interviews, and much more. That'll be right down in the description below. So yeah, that's about all we've got for now. Our next video will most likely be an update on Quant Network before we begin deep diving into some other rabbit holes. So until next time everyone, be sure to stay safe and keep learning. I'll catch you next time. Peace.